In the history of evil, some names are famous. They are the designers of pain, the managers of destruction. We know these names. We turn away from them. But what about the names that are in a gray area between pure evil and organized work? What about the men who were not cruel for pleasure, but were office workers of death? Men who signed papers that ended lives and then went home to their families. This is the story of a man like that. He was an SS Obersturmbannführer, a high-ranking officer in the group that acted as the Third Reich's most feared force. He was a commandant at the center of the Holocaust, the dark heart of a system of pain that stretched across a continent, Auschwitz. But he wasn't the commandant most people think of. He was the man who came after, the man who, for a few short months, brought a strange, hard-to-notice change to the feeling of terror. He claimed he tried to lessen the pain. He claimed he wasn't a murderer. This is the story of Arthur Liebehenschel, the commandant of Auschwitz who claimed he showed mercy. And it's the story of the hangman's rope that gave a very different kind of final judgment. He was the commandant of Auschwitz who ordered the hated standing cells to be removed and stopped certain executions. This gave him a name for mercy among a few prisoners. But this same man was in charge of the planned murder of thousands. He was an office worker in a factory that only produced death. This is the story of the commandant who claimed mercy and the trial where his life was ended by a rope. Before a man becomes a monster, he is just a man. Arthur Liebehenschel was born on November 25, 1901. Many records say he was born in Posen, a city in Germany, but he was actually born in Brunn, which is now in the Czech Republic. He was, however, raised in Posen. His childhood was normal, and he grew up in a strict home where his father was in charge. He studied business and government, subjects that pointed to a life of order, rules, and quiet office work. The Great War, the huge event that shaped his generation, passed him by because he was too young to fight. But the disorder that followed the war did not. In 1919, Liebehenschel joined a right-wing armed group, one of many that formed from the ruins of the German Empire. They were full of unhappy soldiers and young men who wanted structure. It was his first taste of a life based on a uniform and an ideology. After that, he served a normal time in the German army, where he became a sergeant major. It was a career of rules, not extreme belief. His life took a sharp turn in 1932. As Germany's government fell apart, Liebehenschel, like millions of other Germans, was pulled in by the promises of the Nazi Party. He joined. 2 years later, in 1934, he took the much bigger step of joining the SS. At that moment, his life changed from normal forever. He was no longer just a soldier, he was a political soldier, a member of the elite guard meant to protect the new government. His new job was inside the growing concentration camp system. He started as an assistant at the Lichtenberg concentration camp, one of the first camps for political prisoners. He was a paper pusher in a place of pain. From there, he was moved to the concentration camps inspectorate in Berlin, the main office for the entire network. Here, under the command of the infamous Theodor Eicke, Liebehenschel learned the business of organized cruelty. He became an expert in the planning of oppression. By 1942, he was a top manager in the SS main economic and administrative office. He wasn't a wild street fighter or a leader with a magnetic personality. He was an administrator, a manager. He helped the Nazi cause not with powerful speeches, but with neat paperwork and good organization. The Nazi government often used coded words to hide its horrors. In one scary example, executions were not called executions. They were called the completion of war-essential tasks. Even murder was turned into a neutral office term. This was the man who, in the winter of 1943, was given a new job. He was being sent east, to Poland. He was to become the new commandant of Auschwitz. On December 1, 1943, SS officer Arthur Liebehenschel arrived at Auschwitz. He was there to replace a man whose name would be forever linked with the camp, Rudolf Höss. Höss was the man who built Auschwitz into a death camp and managed its terrible growth. His rule was one of pure, extreme terror. Liebehenschel was stepping into the shadow of one of history's greatest mass murderers. The camp he took over, called Auschwitz I, was a carefully organized world of suffering. When he arrived, it held between 16,000 and 19,000 prisoners. These were mostly not the Jewish people being sent straight to the gas chambers in the nearby Birkenau camp, also called Auschwitz II. The prisoners of Auschwitz I were a mix of political prisoners, resistance fighters, Poles, Soviet prisoners of war, and others the Nazis saw as enemies. They were there for slave labor, to be re-educated through pain, and to die from work, hunger, sickness, or execution. The very air of Auschwitz I was thick with fear. Punishment was random and cruel. The symbols of this terror were well known inside the camp's electric fences. There was Block 11, the camp prison, a place of terrible horror. Inside Block 11 were the Statszellen, or standing cells. These were 4 tall, narrow brick spaces, each smaller than 1 square meter. 4 prisoners would be forced inside. They had to stay standing in complete darkness, with no room to sit or bend down for many nights. It was a form of slow, painful torture. Just outside Block 11 stood the Black Wall. This was where thousands were killed, usually with a single pistol shot to the back of the head. It was a place of routine, factory-like killing, done for any number of crimes, like trying to escape, stealing a potato, or just being chosen for no reason. This was the kingdom that Arthur Liebehenschel, the career office worker, was now going to rule. He was a man better suited for a desk than a death camp, but here he was. The prisoners watched him arrive with tired worry. They had no idea that this quiet, plain-looking man was about to make changes that would send ripples through the camp and confuse historians even today. Soon after taking command, Liebehenschel started to make changes. They were not huge changes. They were not a rejection of the Nazi system, but in a place like Auschwitz, they felt enormous. For the prisoners who lived in constant danger, any small reduction in random cruelty felt like a wave of relief. One of his first and most important orders was the removal of the standing cells in Block 11. The hated Statszellen, those upright tombs, were taken apart. For the prisoners, this was more than just a physical change. It was a symbol. It was the removal of one of the camp's most feared tools of torture. Next, Liebehenschel changed the routine of executions. He ordered a stop to the regular bunker selections in Block 11, where prisoners were simply pulled from their cells and sentenced to death. He even gave a pardon to some prisoners who were already waiting to be executed. Then, he ordered the Black Wall itself to be torn down. The place where thousands had been shot was taken apart, its dark purpose seemingly gone. These actions gave Liebehenschel a strange and mixed reputation. To some, these were acts of mercy, small signs of humanity in the deepest pit of evil. Survivors later said his time in charge was a period when the constant crushing terror eased just a little. He was seen as a man who, unlike the Commandant before him, didn't seem to enjoy cruelty. But was it mercy? Or was it something else? Was this a man with a troubled conscience trying to smooth the rough edges of a terrible machine? Or was he just a better manager who knew that random terror was bad for work? After all, Auschwitz was not just a death camp, it was also a huge slave labor center. A workforce that isn't being randomly tortured might just work harder. The reason for his improvements is still a question. But while the prisoners of Auschwitz I saw this small break, the main purpose of the camp complex had not changed at all. The improvements Liebehenschel made at Auschwitz I were a thin, false layer covering a deep pit of evil. They were small changes to one part of a huge death factory. While he was taking apart standing cells, the main purpose of Auschwitz, planned factory-style killing, continued at full, terrible speed. His changes only affected the regular prisoners of the main camp. They did not apply to the hundreds of thousands of Jewish people arriving in cattle cars at the train platforms of the nearby Birkenau camp. The selections on the platform, where SS doctors decided with a flick of a finger who would live a short while and who would die right away, continued without stopping. The gas chambers and ovens of Birkenau, the true engines of the final solution, worked day and night. Thousands died every single day. The murderous nature of Auschwitz did not change. Liebehenschel, the man of mercy, was not separate from this process. He was the Standortleiter, the highest-ranking officer of the entire Auschwitz base. The killing machine operated under his command. Survivors would later directly connect him to selections and the cruel treatment of prisoners. The idea that he was just an office worker who didn't know about the mass murder happening a short distance away is not true. Even his promises within Auschwitz I turned out to be empty. He had supposedly stopped certain gassings, but prisoners saved one day might be sent to the gas chambers weeks later. His promise to protect the sick was a lie. During his time as Commandant, the food, medical supplies, and cleanliness in the prisoner hospital did not get any better. For the prisoners, a promise from the Commandant was worth less than a piece of bread. It was a brief moment of hope, almost always followed by the crushing return of reality. The Commandant before him, Rudolf Höss, watched Liebehenschel's time with disgust. He later criticized him for being too soft to run a concentration camp well. In Höss's view, Liebehenschel's management style was a failure because it didn't use absolute terror. But from another point of view, Liebehenschel's method was maybe even more sinister. By removing the most obvious acts of cruelty, public executions, painful tortures, he made the process of killing more orderly, more efficient, and more like an office job. The system of mass murder became less about the random violence of individual guards and more about the smooth, organized flow of a well-run machine. It was genocide with a tidy desk. The Commandant who claimed mercy didn't stop the killing. He just made it run more quietly, hiding the horror behind the appearance of normal work. He wasn't a savior. He was a manager, and his business was death. Arthur Liebehenschel's time as the merciful Commandant of Auschwitz was very short. It lasted only about 6 months, from December 1943 to May 1944. He wasn't removed for moral reasons. Instead, it was a mix of office politics and a messy personal life. The complaints from hardliners like Rudolf Höss, who thought Liebehenschel was too soft, were certainly a factor. But the final reason for his removal seems to have been a personal scandal. Liebehenschel, who was divorced from his first wife, started a relationship with a woman named Anneliese Hüttemann. His boss, Oswald Pohl, was strongly against the relationship and ordered him to end it. Liebehenschel refused. On May 8, 1944, he was removed from his position at Auschwitz. His replacement was Richard Baer, who would oversee the last, desperate phase of killing at the camp. But Liebehenschel's career in the camp system wasn't over. On May 19, 1944, he was made Commandant of the Majdanek concentration camp near Lublin. By the time he arrived, however, the Soviet Red Army was moving forward quickly, and the Nazis were already starting to empty the camp. His command there was short and disorganized. As the war on the Eastern Front fell apart, Liebehenschel was moved again. This time, he was sent to Trieste, Italy. He worked under Odilo Globoknik, the famous SS leader who had managed the murder of over 1.5 million Jews in Operation Reinhard. There, Liebehenschel was put in charge of the SS Manpower Office. He was back to being a manager of personnel, far from the fighting. He had gone from a desk in Berlin to Commandant of the world's most famous death camp, and now back to a desk in Italy. As the Third Reich died in the spring of 1945, Arthur Liebehenschel was in Austria. The war was over. The time for justice was about to begin. When Nazi Germany fell, the hunters became the hunted. SS officers all over Europe tried to disappear into the confusion after the war. Arthur Liebehenschel was one of them, but his job had been too high level, his name too connected to the Holocaust machine. He was arrested in Austria by the US Army. During his first questionings, Liebehenschel began to build the story he would stick to until the very end. He presented himself not as a killer, but as a man who had actively tried to reduce the pain of prisoners. He pointed to his improvements, removing the standing cells, ending public executions. He strongly denied any personal part in mass murder, saying he had never given such an order. This was the birth of the Commandant who claimed mercy. It was a defense built on the idea that if he hadn't personally pulled a trigger or dropped the Zyklon B poison, he couldn't be a murderer. But the Nazi government kept detailed records. The paperwork was proof against him, and more importantly, there were thousands of survivors. Each one was a living witness who could take apart his claims of mercy. The Allied powers agreed that war criminals should be tried in the countries where their crimes happened. For the men and women who ran Auschwitz, that meant one place, Poland. Liebehenschel was sent to Polish authorities. He was taken to Krakow and put in the Montelupich prison. The Gestapo had used this same prison as a brutal questioning center during the war. The former master of a camp system was now a prisoner in a jail once run by his own organization. In November 1947, he and 39 other former SS staff from Auschwitz would be brought to a courtroom to face justice. The Krakow Auschwitz trial began on November 24, 1947. It was a huge event. In a crowded courtroom, 40 men and women who had been the masters of Auschwitz now sat in the defendant's area. At the head of the list, defendant number 1 was Arthur Liebehenschel. The charges were war crimes and crimes against humanity. The prosecution argued that he was not just a watcher, but an active manager of a place designed for mass murder. The trial lasted for a month, filled with painful stories and dark evidence. A long line of survivors took the stand. Their voices filled the courtroom with descriptions of starvation, beatings, medical experiments, and the constant feeling of death. When it was his turn, Liebehenschel stuck to his story. He was a reformer, a man who brought decency. He repeated his list of improvements. In one of the boldest claims made during the post-war trials, he supposedly told his questioners he had tried to turn Auschwitz into a sanatorium, a place of healing. He said this while thousands were being gassed and burned every day under his command. The prosecution destroyed his defense. They argued that a person doesn't need to personally pull the trigger to be responsible for murder. Liebehenschel's signature was on the papers that kept the camp running. His power was the cover under which the terrible acts were committed. For the survivors watching, the way all the defendants denied being guilty was disgusting. Halina Nelken, a survivor who wrote about the trial for a newspaper, wrote about their stories. There is something horribly disgusting in the behavior of the defendants. They are not great devils. They murdered on command. They tormented for pleasure. Criminal, shameful little people. Liebehenschel was not a great devil. He was an office worker who claimed he was just managing a system, just trying to make things a little better, all while in charge of a factory of death. He claimed he was a man of mercy. But the court was about to give a very different decision. On December 22, 1947, just before Christmas, the highest court in Krakow gave its judgment. The month of stories was over. The denials had been heard. The courtroom was silent. The court found them guilty, guilty of war crimes, guilty of crimes against humanity. The judge, explaining the decision, rejected the defense that they were just following orders. He said that it was clear they were involved in the murderous system. The verdict stressed that the defendants showed they were willing to take part in killing, which was more than just obeying commands. Then came the sentences. Of the 40 defendants, 23 were sentenced to death by hanging. Liebehenschel was one of them. His claims of mercy had been completely rejected. The court saw him for what he was, a senior officer whose management skills were key to running a death camp. Whether he enjoyed it or not did not matter. He had done it. 3 others received life in prison, while several more received long prison sentences. Only one defendant was found not guilty. Liebehenschel, who once held the power of life and death over tens of thousands, was now a prisoner sentenced to die. He had a little over a month to live. According to his daughter, he knew at the end that there was no escape. The sentence was not just a legal decision, it was a moral statement. The Commandant who had managed a system of death was now himself managed by a system of justice. His final destination would not be a place of healing, but a gallows. On January 24, 1948, the sentences were carried out. Arthur Liebehenschel, age 46, was taken to the execution room inside the Krakow prison. This was not a quick and clean execution. Along with 20 other staff from Auschwitz who were sentenced to die, he was led to the gallows. The method was not the modern long drop, which is designed for a quick death. It was the older, rougher, short drop method. He was made to stand on a small stool, a noose was placed around his neck, and the stool was kicked away. Death came slowly, from being strangled. It was a brutal end, just like the brutal system he had served. But before the stool was kicked away, Liebehenschel did something amazing. It was something that, like his actions at Auschwitz, did not seem to make sense. He shouted his last words. They weren't "Heil Hitler." According to some reports, which are debated and may not be true, his final words were, "Long live Poland. Long live Poland." The reported words hang in the air, a final, shocking puzzle. What could he have meant? A desperate request for mercy, a mean, mocking gesture, or maybe a strangely timed acceptance of the nation his government had tried to destroy? We can never know. Like the mercy he claimed to have shown, his last reported words are a mystery. With those words supposedly spoken, the stool was removed. And Arthur Liebehenschel, the commandant who studied business, the administrator who managed the paperwork of murder, the man who claimed mercy, was hanged.